Welcome to Books and More, where knowledge meets curiosity and every page opens a new world of ideas. In today's episode, we dive into Currency Wars by Song Hongbing, a powerful exploration of how money, power, and global politics intertwine behind the scenes. This book reveals the hidden battles that shape economies, influence nations, and define the course of history. Whether you're passionate about finance, strategy, or world affairs, this journey will change the way you see money forever. Stay tuned and let's uncover the secrets of global finance together. Chapter 1: Waterloo of Napoleon and the Triumph of Rothschild. In the great game of power and money that shaped modern Europe, no event symbolized the dominance of financial intelligence more vividly than the Battle of Waterloo. Not because of Napoleon's defeat, but because of the rise of Nathan Rothschild. While the cannons thundered on the Belgian plains, another kind of battle was being fought, one of information, speed, and cunning. Nathan Rothschild, the third son of Mayor Amschel Rothschild, had already built an intricate web of couriers, traders, and informants across Europe. To him, information was wealth, and timing was power. When Wellington's forces clashed with Napoleon's army, Nathan's network moved faster than any government's. His agents witnessed the decisive moments, and within hours, he knew that Napoleon had been crushed. By dawn, while the rest of Europe still trembled in uncertainty, Nathan was already on his way to London with the news that would make him the most powerful man in Britain. Arriving in London ahead of all official messengers, Nathan entered the stock exchange with a face of cold composure. He said nothing, but his movements spoke volumes. Quietly, he began selling British government bonds. The room froze. The man whose intelligence was always reliable seemed to be signaling defeat. Panic spread like wildfire. Traders rushed to sell, convinced that Wellington had lost and that Britain was doomed. In a matter of hours, the price of British bonds collapsed to a fraction of their value. Then, in absolute silence, Rothschild's agents began buying back everything they had just sold, at prices so low they bordered on theft. When, a day later, the official news arrived that Wellington had triumphed, the market exploded upward. Rothschild, who had purchased nearly all available bonds, now controlled the financial heartbeat of the British Empire. With one audacious maneuver, he had turned intelligence into an empire. From that day forward, the Bank of England, and indeed much of Britain's economy, would move to the rhythm of Rothschild's will. The lesson of Waterloo was clear. Wars are not won only with armies, but with money. And money answers to those who control its creation and flow. The Rothschilds had mastered this truth. Through their international network, with brothers in Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, they became the first truly global financial power. Each brother acted as a node in a vast private banking empire, bound not by contracts, but by blood, loyalty, and secrecy. Their correspondence, delivered by private couriers, moved faster and more securely than any government dispatch. They financed wars, stabilized governments, and dictated the fate of monarchs. While kings ruled territories, the Rothschilds ruled credit, the invisible force that sustained nations. From this foundation arose a new kind of empire, one that needed no army, no flag, no borders. It was built on debt, interest, and influence. The Rothschild understood that controlling a nation's money supply was far more powerful than controlling its laws. "Give me control of a nation's money," Nathan is said to have declared, "and I care not who makes its laws." And indeed, by controlling the issuance of bonds, the lifeblood of government finance, the Rothschilds could determine the rise or fall of any kingdom. The taxes of British citizens, the debts of European monarchs, even the wars of empires, all became tributaries flowing into their vaults. In this first chapter, I reveal not merely a story of wealth, but the birth of financial warfare, a conflict fought with information, credit, and confidence rather than soldiers and cannons. It marked the dawn of a new age where bankers, not generals, decided the destiny of nations. The world has long celebrated the victory of Wellington and the defeat of Napoleon, but few realize that the true victor of Waterloo was not on the battlefield. He sat quietly in the London Stock Exchange, orchestrating a financial symphony whose echoes still shape our world today. From that day forward, the Rothschild family stood as the unseen monarchs of Europe, the architects of modern money, and the shadow emperors of economic power. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Rothschild Empire. The true power of the Rothschild family did not emerge overnight. It was the product of centuries of financial evolution, sharpened by intelligence and secrecy. To understand their rise, one must first understand the transformation of money itself. In the 17th century, England, drained by wars and extravagance, faced an empty treasury. When King William III needed funds for his campaigns against France, he accepted a revolutionary idea: a private central bank that would lend money to the government in exchange for the right to issue paper currency. Thus, the Bank of England was born in 1694, the first of its kind, privately owned yet controlling the nation's money. The government borrowed £1.2 million, paying interest to private bankers, and in return allowed them to print money backed by this debt. From that moment, the power to create money, once the privilege of kings, passed into the hands of financiers. It was the beginning of a system where nations would forever live in debt to private banking interests. The Rothschilds entered this world of emerging paper money with perfect timing. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, the patriarch, was a shrewd and disciplined man who understood both the psychology of rulers and the mechanics of finance. Born in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, he began as a coin dealer but soon turned his small shop into a financial hub. His genius was not in gold or silver, but in trust. He earned the confidence of powerful men, especially Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest monarchs in Europe. When revolutions shook the continent, Prince William entrusted Mayer with his immense fortune for safekeeping. Mayer did not merely guard the money, he multiplied it. Using the prince's capital as leverage, he financed trade, lent to governments, and laid the foundation of an international financial network that would one day dominate Europe. Mayer understood a truth that few grasped: money grows not by hoarding it, but by moving it, quickly, quietly, and across borders. To achieve this, he needed agents he could trust absolutely. So he turned to his 5 sons, whom he trained with almost military precision. Each was sent to a different European capital: Amschel in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Kalman in Naples, and James in Paris. Together, they formed an invisible empire, 5 brothers controlling 5 banks, connected by coded letters and couriers faster than any government messenger. They created the world's first international financial communication network capable of transferring information and funds across Europe in days rather than weeks. It was this speed and coordination that gave them power beyond measure. The brilliance of the Rothschild strategy lay in its unity. While kings and ministers changed with the tides of politics, the 5 brothers acted as one. When wars broke out, they lent to both sides, not out of malice, but because they understood that conflict was profitable only when credit survived it. They sold arms, funded armies, and insured governments, yet remained untouched by the chaos they financed. Their loyalty was not to nations, but to stability, because in the ruins of every war lay the opportunity to rebuild, with interest. By the early 19th century, the Rothschilds had become indispensable to Europe's rulers. Their letters could save a kingdom from bankruptcy or plunge a rival into economic despair. Their reputation for discretion and efficiency made them the first choice for monarchs in need of funds. But their true weapon was the bond market, the tool that allowed them to control entire economies without firing a shot. Governments issued bonds. The Rothschilds decided the terms, the buyers, and the prices. In doing so, they became the gatekeepers of credit, the silent arbiters of destiny. The second chapter of this story reveals a profound shift in human history, the transformation of wealth from tangible gold into invisible promises of repayment. The Rothschilds mastered this new reality, turning debt into power and money into influence. They proved that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword, not the pen of politicians or philosophers, but of bankers, writing loan agreements that bound nations for generations. What began in the cramped quarters of a Frankfurt ghetto had become an empire without borders, governed not by bloodshed, but by balance sheets. The Rothschilds had unlocked the secret of modern empire building. Whoever controls credit controls the world. Chapter 3: The Birth of the Federal Reserve, a Private Empire of Money. In this chapter, I reveal one of the greatest secrets in modern history: how the world's most powerful democracy surrendered its monetary sovereignty to a small circle of private bankers. The creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in 1913 was not an act of public service, but a masterpiece of financial deception. It was the culmination of centuries of strategy by international banking dynasties led by the Rothschilds and their American allies, the Morgans, Rockefellers, and Warburgs. While the American people believed they were gaining a central bank to stabilize the economy, what they truly received was a privately owned institution that would control interest rates, manipulate credit, and profit from the nation's debt. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was in turmoil. Financial panics, particularly the crash of 1907, had shaken public confidence. But behind these crises, the powerful bankers saw opportunity. The panic had been engineered, or at least amplified, by J.P. Morgan himself to create a sense of urgency for reform. Newspapers screamed for stability, and politicians echoed the call. The solution seemed clear: a central authority to manage the nation's money supply. Yet the true question was, who would control this authority? The answer was determined not in the halls of Congress, but in secrecy, on an isolated island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. There, in 1910, 7 men representing a quarter of the world's wealth gathered in the shadows. Among them were Senator Nelson Aldrich, Paul Warburg, Henry Davidson of J.P. Morgan & Co., Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, and Benjamin Strong, who would later head the New York Federal Reserve. They traveled under false names, claiming to be on a duck hunting trip. Behind closed doors, they drafted a plan that would forever change the American Republic, the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. It was a private cartel masquerading as a public institution. Its design ensured that while the government appeared to oversee the system, real control rested with the bankers themselves. The mechanics of this scheme were elegant and sinister. The Federal Reserve would be authorized to issue money, but not money backed by gold or silver, rather by government debt. Whenever the U.S. Treasury needed funds, it would issue bonds. The Federal Reserve would purchase them with money created from nothing, pure credit. This cycle of borrowing and lending made the bankers indispensable. The government, once master of its own currency, became a permanent debtor. The more it borrowed, the more interest it paid, and the more power the bankers gained. Inflation and deflation could now be manipulated at will, allowing financial elites to transfer wealth invisibly from the public to themselves. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, it was sold to the public as a safeguard against crisis. President Woodrow Wilson, persuaded by advisors deeply connected to Wall Street, signed the bill into law. Yet years later, he would express bitter regret, writing that the country had been placed under the control of an invisible government, owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. His lament was not an exaggeration. From that point onward, the destiny of the American economy would be decided not by elected officials, but by unelected bankers sitting in private boardrooms. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Federal Reserve's manipulation of interest rates fueled both the prosperity of the 1920s and the Great Depression that followed. Wars, too, became more profitable, financed not by taxes but by loans. Every conflict, from World War I onward, enriched the same financial houses that had designed the system. The Rothschild's formula, control the credit of nations and you control their destinies, had now reached its ultimate form in the heart of America. In this chapter, I do not merely recount a historical event. I reveal the architecture of a silent empire, one that replaced the visible role of monarchs with the invisible role of money. The Federal Reserve was not just a bank. It was a declaration of financial independence from democracy itself. From that moment, every dollar printed became a note of debt, and every citizen, knowingly or not, a servant to the same global power that had mastered Europe a century before. This was not just the rise of a new institution. It was the coronation of the bankers as the true emperors of the modern world. Chapter 4. Wars and Depressions, the Banker's Invisible Hands. The fourth chapter unveils the dark symbiosis between war, economic collapse, and the invisible power of finance. History is often told through the lens of generals and politicians, but behind every battlefield, behind every flag and ideology, there stands an even greater force, the flow of money. Wars are not only fought with billets and blood, they are financed, designed, and prolonged by those who profit from both victory and defeat. This chapter exposes how the great banking families, through their control of credit and currency, turned global conflicts into instruments of immense wealth and domination. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the ink on the Federal Reserve Act was barely dry. Yet it was precisely this new financial mechanism that enabled the United States to become the world's largest creditor while Europe bled itself dry. The Rothschilds, Morgans, and Warburgs, though divided by nationality, were united by interest. They financed both sides of the conflict through loans, bonds, and weapons contracts. The British borrowed billions through J.P. Morgan & Co., which acted as the official purchasing agent for the Allied forces. Meanwhile, German industry was supported by banks connected to the same international network. Money, as always, had no allegiance. It sought only profit and power. By controlling the issuance of war bonds and manipulating interest rates, these bankers made fortunes while nations descended into ruin. Every shell fired and every ship sunk was paid for by future generations through debt. Governments promised their citizens that victory would bring prosperity, yet what followed was a world shackled to the banks that had financed the destruction. When the war ended in 1918, the winners were not the nations who had fought, but the financiers who held their IOUs. The Treaty of Versailles, with its crushing reparations imposed on Germany, was less a peace treaty than a financial trap, a means to guarantee the continuous flow of interest payments across borders. The 1920s appeared to bring recovery, but the prosperity was an illusion, a house of credit built on sand. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply, flooding the markets with cheap loans and speculation. Stock prices soared, consumption exploded, and optimism blinded the masses. But behind the euphoria, the bankers were already preparing the next act. When the time was ripe, they tightened credit, raised interest rates, and watched as the entire structure collapsed. The crash of 1929 was no accident. It was the culmination of deliberate monetary manipulation. Millions lost their homes, their savings, and their livelihoods, while the same banking elites bought back real assets, land, factories, and companies at a fraction of their former value. The Great Depression was, in truth, a controlled demolition of the global economy. As the world starved, a new opportunity emerged. War, once again, would become the great engine of recovery. The financiers understood that destruction is the most profitable form of investment. It demands reconstruction, and reconstruction demands credit. Thus began the massive rearmament of the 1930s, financed through loans and bonds orchestrated by the same banking institutions that had caused the collapse. When World War II erupted, the machinery of finance whirred into motion once more. The same formula repeated: lend to governments, sell them arms, control their currencies, and reap the profits of chaos. Nations were reduced to debtors, their sovereignty mortgaged to those who printed the money they fought with. This chapter reveals that neither war nor depression are natural cycles. They are engineered instruments of control. The bankers learned that fear and scarcity create the perfect conditions for obedience. When people are desperate, they don't question who controls the money, they only beg for more of it. The invisible empire of finance feeds on crisis, for in crisis lies the opportunity to tighten its grip. Wars destroy nations, but strengthen empires, not empires of territory, but empires of debt. From this perspective, the 20th century was not merely a sequence of political conflicts, but a continuous financial war, one waged in the shadows by those who understood that the surest path to global dominion is not through conquest of land, but through conquest of money. And as the world would soon learn, those who control credit do not need to raise armies. They already command them. Chapter 5. The New Policy of Cheap Money. The fifth chapter marks the dawn of a new age in the global financial war, the era of cheap money. This was not merely an economic policy, but a deliberate strategy by international bankers to reshape the world's financial order. The idea was simple yet devastating. Flood the market with credit, lower interest rates, and make borrowing irresistibly easy. To the public, this seemed like prosperity. To governments, it appeared as recovery. But beneath this glittering illusion, the architects of finance were building an invisible empire, one based not on gold or production, but on endless debt and dependency. After the devastation of the Great Depression, the world was desperate for stability. Politicians and economists looked for a way to revive growth, and the bankers offered their familiar prescription: expand the money supply, stimulate spending, and let credit flow freely. The Federal Reserve led the way, slashing interest rates and opening the floodgates of liquidity. What followed was an era of apparent recovery, but one sustained entirely by borrowed money. Nations rebuilt their industries not with real wealth, but with paper promises. And just as a patient addicted to morphine feels relief while the poison spreads, the global economy became addicted to easy credit, unable to function without it. The theory behind cheap money was cloaked in noble rhetoric. Economists claimed that low interest rates would encourage investment, create jobs, and prevent future crises. But in truth, it was a weapon of control. By manipulating credit, central banks could direct the flow of money to favored corporations, industries, or governments. Those aligned with the financial elite received unlimited capital. Those who resisted were starved of funds. Money became not a neutral medium of exchange, but a tool of power, one that could reward obedience and punish independence. The most chilling aspect of this policy was how it eroded real value. When governments print money faster than wealth is created, inflation becomes inevitable. Prices rise, savings lose meaning, and the middle class, the foundation of every stable society, is quietly impoverished. Wages could not keep pace with the cost of living, and the illusion of prosperity masked a growing chasm between the rich and the poor. Yet while ordinary citizens suffered, those who owned the means of credit thrived. Bankers could create money from nothing, lend it at interest, and reclaim real assets, land, resources, and companies when the inevitable defaults occurred. The cycle of lending, inflation, and foreclosure became the invisible machinery of conquest. Lenin once said that the best way to destroy capitalism is to debauch its currency. Ironically, the international financiers achieved exactly that, not to destroy capitalism, but to dominate it. By turning money itself into a commodity, they created a system in which every transaction, every salary, every loan ultimately flowed through their hands. Nations no longer needed to be invaded or colonized, they could be captured through credit. The debt of a country became the leash of its sovereignty. The chapter also reveals how this strategy laid the foundation for a global order centered on the US dollar. After World War II, America held most of the world's gold, and its currency became the standard of exchange. The Federal Reserve's policy of easy money spread worldwide through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both designed, as the author argues, to export the same system of debt dependence to the developing world. Poor nations were lured with soft loans that promised development but delivered servitude. In exchange for funding, they surrendered their resources, policies, and autonomy. Debt became the new form of colonization. The age of cheap money transformed the world's financial landscape. It created the illusion of abundance while draining the real wealth of nations. It allowed the few to live like gods while billions toiled in the shadow of inflation and debt. What began as a policy of recovery became a weapon of domination. And as Song Hongbing warns, the true danger lies not in the visible wars fought with guns, but in the invisible wars fought with currency, wars that enslave not bodies, but entire economies. The chapter closes with a haunting truth. When money is cheap, freedom is expensive, and the world was already paying the price. Chapter 6. The elite club that rules the world. In this chapter, the veil of secrecy is lifted on the invisible network that dictates the fate of nations, a small, powerful group often called the financial elite. While the world believes it is governed by presidents and parliaments, the true architects of global policy operate from private meeting rooms, hidden foundations, and unaccountable institutions. These men, bankers, industrial magnates, and political strategists, see themselves not as citizens of any country, but as custodians of a global empire built on finance. Their ultimate goal is not mere wealth, but control of money, markets, media, and minds. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II, when the old world order lay in ruins and a new one was being constructed. Under the guise of peace and cooperation, the elite formed a network of organizations to consolidate their influence. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, in the United States, the Bilderberg Group in Europe, and the Trilateral Commission linking North America, Europe, and Asia. These were not democratic forums, but private assemblies where the most powerful figures in banking, business, and politics coordinated strategy. Behind closed doors, they decided who would lead nations, what policies would be implemented, and how crises would be used to advance their agenda. The public saw treaties and conferences. The insiders saw blueprints for a new kind of empire. Their method was subtle and systematic. By controlling money through central banks, they could steer economies. By funding both sides of political debates, they ensured that no matter who won elections, the same interests prevailed. And by shaping education and media, they molded public opinion to accept their vision of a globalized world, a world where borders blur, currencies unify, and sovereignty dissolves under the authority of international finance. To many, this was presented as progress. To the author, it was the quiet emergence of a financial dictatorship. At the heart of this system lies the Rothschild legacy, not merely a family fortune, but a philosophy of control through debt and information. The Rockefellers extended it across the Atlantic, weaving it into the corporate fabric of America. Through institutions like Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation, and their deep influence in energy and media, they transformed economic power into cultural dominance. Together with allies like the Morgans and the Warburgs, they created a transnational alliance of capital that no government could easily defy. The chapter describes the 1954 meeting at the Hotel de Bilderberg in the Netherlands, a moment that symbolized the birth of modern global governance. Politicians, bankers, and media tycoons gathered not to debate, but to align. They discussed how to manage the Cold War, stabilize markets, and control the flow of resources. The agenda was never published, the minutes were never released. Yet from that point forward, many key global decisions, from monetary policy to wars in distant lands, seemed to echo the interests of those present. Nations became instruments in a symphony conducted by unseen hands. This elite network also perfected the art of manufacturing crises to consolidate power. Economic collapses, oil shocks, and even environmental movements became tools for financial expansion. Under noble slogans like sustainability or world cooperation, new institutions were born. Global banks, funds, and green financial mechanisms, each tightening the web of dependency around developing nations. The debt for nature swaps and IMF restructuring plans were not acts of charity, but acts of acquisition. Through debt, they acquired land, minerals, and influence, often in countries too weak to resist. The author's tone in this chapter is one of warning. He sees the modern world drifting toward a centralized system of financial control, disguised as democracy. National leaders appear to govern, but true power lies elsewhere, in the boardrooms of the few who control credit, currency, and the channels of communication. The elite club does not march with armies. It rules through contracts and loans. Its empire has no borders, only balance sheets. This chapter leaves the reader with a haunting realization. The world is not governed by chance, but by design. Every boom and bust, every election and treaty serves a higher purpose: the slow transfer of sovereignty from nations to networks of capital. The war for power has moved beyond the battlefield. It now unfolds in markets, media, and minds. And those who do not understand this silent war risk becoming its most obedient soldiers, paying, obeying, and believing while never knowing who commands them. Chapter 7. The Real War of Money. This chapter exposes the most sophisticated and silent form of warfare ever created: the financial war, fought not with guns, but with currencies, interest rates, and international debt. Unlike the wars of the past that left cities in ruins and soldiers dead, the new wars are waged in boardrooms, stock exchanges, and central banks. Their victims are nations stripped of sovereignty, and their conquerors are bankers who never fire a shot. After World War II, the traditional empires had crumbled, but a new empire arose, one ruled by credit. The United States, armed with the dollar and the Bretton Woods system, assumed leadership of this global financial order. Gold became secondary, while paper money, backed only by the promise of the U.S. Treasury, turned into the new weapon of domination. The dollar was no longer just a currency, it was a claim on the world's wealth. By controlling the flow of dollars, America, and the banking elites behind it, could manipulate global trade, debt, and even political outcomes without direct conquest. But as the system expanded, it became clear that not all nations could bear the burden. Developing countries, desperate for modernization, turned to the IMF and the World Bank for help. They were offered loans under the banner of economic assistance, yet each loan came with invisible chains, conditions that forced them to open their markets, privatize assets, and surrender control of their currencies. Debt became the new colonialism. By the 1980s, many nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia were caught in what Song Hongbing calls the debt trap, an endless cycle of borrowing to repay previous loans, with interest accumulating faster than development could proceed. The chapter introduces one of the most cunning instruments of this modern empire: the debt for nature swap. It was presented to the world as a humanitarian and environmental initiative, a way to forgive debt in exchange for protecting nature. But behind the green rhetoric was a sinister design. Under this scheme, developing nations transferred vast tracts of land and natural resources to international environmental banks controlled by Western financiers. As the author notes, more than 50 million square kilometers of land, nearly a third of the Earth's surface, was effectively pledged as collateral. Under the guise of saving the planet, the bankers were seizing its most valuable real estate. These environmental banks and global funds were the evolution of institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Their loans were labeled as soft, but their impact was hard and irreversible. Nations unable to repay found themselves legally bound to surrender forests, mines, and oil reserves. What began as a financial relationship transformed into de facto ownership. The author argues that this system was designed not to save the poor, but to harvest them, to extract wealth through mechanisms invisible to ordinary people, but devastating in their effect. Song Hongbing describes this as the real war of money, where governments and corporations are mere instruments in a larger strategy. Wars are no longer necessary when one can conquer through currency. Inflation, debt crises, and financial sanctions replace armies and bombs. The invisible battlefield stretches across the world's financial markets, and victory belongs to those who control liquidity and credit. Even global movements, environmentalism, humanitarian aid, sustainable development, become tools to expand the reach of this new empire of debt. The chapter concludes with a stark warning. As financial power concentrates further into the hands of a few, the sovereignty of nations erodes. The same families and institutions that orchestrated the Federal Reserve and dominated European finance now govern the destiny of entire continents. The war of money is quiet, patient, and bloodless on the surface, yet it enslaves billions. While politicians speak of democracy and globalization, the true rulers of the modern age are those who can print the world's currency and decide who deserves to use it. This, the author declares, is the essence of the New World Order, a system where wars are fought in silence and the victors do not wear uniforms, but suits. Chapter 8: Currency Wars, Battles Without Declaration. In this chapter, the author reveals how the 20th century's most powerful empires learned to wage war without ever declaring it, through the manipulation of currencies and the architecture of global finance. Traditional wars left destruction visible to all. Currency wars are silent, fought in markets, debt agreements, and exchange rates. Yet their consequences are no less devastating. Economies collapse, industries vanish, and nations surrender sovereignty, all without a single bullet being fired. Song Hongbing calls this the invisible battlefield of modern geopolitics, where power is measured not in tanks or missiles, but in the ability to control the money that nations depend on. The narrative begins in the 1970s when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard. This single decision severed the link between money and real value, unleashing a world where currencies floated freely and could be manipulated at will. It was a calculated move. By decoupling the dollar from gold, the United States transformed its currency into the ultimate weapon. Every country that traded, borrowed, or saved in dollars became a participant in America's monetary empire. With the petrodollar system tying global energy prices to U.S. currency, the world was forced to hold and use dollars, giving Washington an unprecedented ability to print wealth and export inflation. The rest of the world, particularly developing nations, paid the hidden cost. Song Hongbing then turns to the financial crises that followed, showing how they were not accidents of economics, but deliberate acts of warfare. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 serves as a chilling example. International hedge funds, armed with insider information and supported by global financial institutions, attacked the currencies of Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. They shorted their currencies, spread fear through the media, and watched as entire economies crumbled within weeks. The IMF, stepping in as a supposed rescuer, imposed structural reforms, privatization, austerity, and open markets that effectively handed national assets to Western investors at fire sale prices. In Song's eyes, this was not assistance but conquest. The nations of Asia had not lost a war, yet they found themselves occupied economically, their central banks and fiscal policies dictated by foreign creditors. The chapter emphasizes that such tactics have become the standard method of global control. Currency devaluation, sanctions, speculative attacks, and debt restructuring are the modern equivalents of blockades and invasions. They destroy confidence, crush local industries, and allow financial elites to acquire real assets, land, energy, and infrastructure for a fraction of their value. The victims are told they are being rescued, but the outcome is the same as defeat: subordination to the global financial order. Unlike the empires of old that relied on soldiers, the new empire rules through spreadsheets and stock indices. At the center of this new warfare is the alliance between central banks, Wall Street, and supranational institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These entities operate beyond the reach of any democratic government, yet they dictate policies that shape the destiny of billions. The author describes them as financial armies without flags, advancing the interests of their sponsors under the language of reform and globalization. Nations that resist, whether by protecting their currency or pursuing independent development, face immediate punishment through capital flight, currency collapse, or sanctions. The message is clear: sovereignty in the 21st century belongs only to those who can defend their money. The author warns that these wars will intensify as global debt mounts and resources dwindle. The next battleground will not be land or oil, but the digital and monetary systems that underlie civilization itself. Countries that fail to build independent financial defenses, such as diversified reserves, alternative payment systems, and sound currencies, risk becoming financial colonies. For China and other rising nations, the lesson is urgent. To survive the next century, they must master the art of monetary warfare and create a new balance in the world's financial order. In closing, Song Hongbing's voice becomes prophetic. The true danger of currency wars lies in their invisibility. People see peace and trade on the surface, while beneath, their savings, industries, and freedoms are quietly stolen. The world no longer needs armies to be conquered. A single financial crisis can achieve the same result. The modern battlefield is the global economy, and the new soldiers are not generals, but bankers. Chapter 9: The Danger of the US Dollar and the Return of Gold. In this chapter, Song Hongbing dissects the fragility of the modern financial system built on the supremacy of the US dollar. He argues that the dollar, once a symbol of strength, has become the world's most dangerous illusion, a currency detached from value, sustained only by political influence and global dependency. When the United States severed its tie to gold in 1971, money ceased to represent wealth and instead became a tool of control. Through the petrodollar system, Washington ensured that oil, the lifeblood of the global economy, could only be traded in dollars, forcing every nation to hold and circulate U.S. currency. It was a silent coup, turning the dollar into a global necessity and giving America the unique power to print prosperity at will. However, this power came at a cost. The dollar's dominance depends not on productivity or savings, but on confidence, a fragile trust that the rest of the world will continue to believe in American paper. As debt piled up and the U.S. consumed more than it produced, this confidence became increasingly artificial. The Federal Reserve, rather than preserving stability, acted as an engine of speculation, creating waves of liquidity that inflated asset bubbles across the world. When crises struck, as in 1929, 1987, or 2008, the solution was always the same: print more money, cut interest rates, and deepen global dependency on the dollar. Each rescue saved the system temporarily, but weakened it structurally, spreading its risks to every economy tethered to the greenback. Song exposes how this monetary hegemony effectively enslaves other nations. Countries that hold dollar reserves are, in truth, lending their wealth to sustain the very empire that exploits them. Every U.S. Treasury bond they buy finances more debt, more wars, and more inflation that devalues their own savings. The dollar, he explains, is both a currency and a weapon, one that extracts tribute through invisible means. Inflation acts as a hidden tax on the world, transferring real value from the global economy to America. The rest of the world works, produces, and exports goods, while the U.S. merely prints the money to buy them. But every empire built on paper eventually faces reality. As the United States expands its debt beyond redemption, confidence erodes and nations begin seeking alternatives. Song warns that when the dollar loses its credibility, the global financial structure will collapse like a pyramid of sand. History, he reminds us, has seen this pattern before. From the Roman denarius to the British pound, every dominant currency falls when its issuer abuses power. The dollar's fate is sealed by the same logic: too much debt, too little discipline, and too much arrogance. Against this bleak backdrop, gold reemerges as the only trustworthy anchor of value. Gold is eternal. It cannot be printed, inflated, or manipulated by decree. Throughout history, every paper currency has eventually returned to gold once confidence was lost. For Song Hongbing, gold is not merely a metal, but a moral principle, a reminder that real wealth must be tied to reality, not promises. He predicts that the next global crisis will trigger a massive revaluation of gold as nations and investors flee from paper into tangible security. In that moment, those who still hold gold, physically, not on paper, will regain independence, while those who rely on fiat money will be crushed under its collapse. The author's conclusion is stark and prophetic. The age of the dollar is ending. Its reign, built on war, oil, and credit, cannot last forever. The world stands on the verge of another transformation, a return to honest money and real value. Song warns that when the illusion of infinite credit finally shatters, the fall will be swift and brutal. Yet, within that collapse lies the hope of renewal, the rebirth of a financial order grounded not in manipulation, but in truth. The future, he suggests, belongs not to those who print money, but to those who understand its real worth. Chapter 10: The Long-Term Conspiracy. In this final chapter, Song Hongbing unveils the grand design behind centuries of financial manipulation, a plan not born from chance, but from deliberate, calculated intent. He describes the long-term conspiracy as a multi-generational project by the world's most powerful banking families to dominate not only the flow of money, but the destiny of nations. The book's earlier chapters have traced how wars, crises, and financial collapses were tools in this strategy. Now, Song concludes by showing how all these threads converge toward a single goal: a global financial empire controlled by a handful of elites. The author begins by reminding the reader that true power is never visible. Governments rise and fall, political ideologies shift, but the same forces remain in control: those who issue and regulate money. The financial oligarchy understands that by controlling credit, they control economies. By controlling economies, they control politics. And through politics, they control the lives of billions. According to Song, this hidden hierarchy operates above nations, using central banks, international institutions, and global corporations as its instruments. Its methods are subtle: debt dependency, monetary inflation, speculative attacks, and the erosion of national sovereignty through financial cooperation. The chapter portrays the post-Cold War era as the moment when this invisible empire reached its most ambitious phase. Under the banners of globalization and free trade, financial capital flowed freely across borders, dissolving economic independence. Developing nations, eager to modernize, opened their markets only to find themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Through the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization, Western financial elites imposed structural reforms that dismantled protectionist policies, privatized state assets, and exposed vulnerable economies to the volatility of global markets. What was presented as liberalization was, in Song's view, a new form of colonialism, the colonization of credit. Song warns that even developed nations are not immune. The United States, once the symbol of industrial might, has become both the wielder and the victim of its own monetary empire. Its prosperity rests on printing the world's reserve currency, but this privilege is a double-edged sword. The ever-growing mountain of debt has transformed America into a debtor nation, hostage to its own financial system. When the dollar finally collapses under its own weight, the consequences will be catastrophic, not only for the U.S., but for the entire world that depends on it. In this way, Song argues, the long-term plan of the global financiers has reached its endgame: to centralize financial control through crisis, paving the way for a unified world currency and a single system of economic governance. The author envisions this coming order as a financial world government, a system where global monetary policy is dictated by unelected technocrats serving private interests. Paper money will gradually be replaced by digital currency, making every transaction traceable, every citizen monitorable, and every government subordinate to global finance. Freedom will no longer be lost through war, but through convenience, the slow surrender of privacy and autonomy in exchange for security and stability. Song sees this as the final evolution of monetary warfare, from visible conquest to invisible enslavement. Yet, despite the grim tone, the chapter also carries a warning and a call to action. Song insists that understanding this system is the first step toward resisting it. Nations must reclaim control over their currencies, rebuild real economies based on production rather than speculation, and establish financial systems rooted in transparency and sovereignty. China, in particular, he argues, must prepare for this confrontation by strengthening its reserves, diversifying away from the dollar, and promoting the yuan as a credible alternative in global trade. The battle for the future will not be fought with weapons, but with monetary policies, digital platforms, and public trust. The chapter closes with a haunting reflection. Humanity has reached a crossroads. One path leads to a future ruled by algorithms, bankers, and invisible empires. The other to a world where money once again serves mankind rather than enslaving it. The long-term conspiracy is not inevitable, but to defeat it, people must first recognize that the war for freedom is no longer fought on battlefields, but in banks.